Hey everybody, welcome back. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving this week. We are back on the Ferrari swapped Porsche 914 here at the Red Barn, and in this episode, it is, you guessed it, more wiring as I try to get everything squared away inside the car, up behind the dash, get the fuel pump connected and all that good stuff, so we can finally someday, soon, hopefully, try and start this thing. Enjoy. And before we get into this episode, let me go back and address a couple comments from last episode. One of them, which I thought was actually a good comment, and when I saw it, I thought, oh, I better explain this. The comment was, I'm not being consistent with my use of wire colors. Like, why isn't power red and ground brown? Some of you know that in the Porsche's, brown is actually the ground color. And the reason for that is that the Haltech system doesn't use that same color strategy, and as you can see, you know, the big power wires for everything, red obviously power, but the ground wires with Haltech are battery ground anyway, are black. And you wouldn't know this because I haven't told you, but as I've been mentioning, I don't have power. I don't have hot going to my switches. Right? The old school, if you will, the original Porsche strategy, vintage car strategy, you know, they ran power to all the switches, and that's what powered everything. Well, remember, I only need signal. And so this is my ground wire. This is signal ground for the Haltech system. It's a black wire with a white stripe. Where I have signal ground going in on my harnesses, it is the black with the white stripe. That is what I've cut over to. Now, it's true that as I transition, you know, from my harness to the factory harness, since I didn't unsolder, desolder any of this and change the wires over, there is a transition point at my Deutsch connector. And I will document that in the documentation for the wiring harness. Now, that said, there are places, and you can see some of it there, the big red wires in the engine harness, those go back to, and the same thing will happen coming from the power management unit. I'm going to just point it at you. There's my fuel pump setup, and you can see red and black wires. So in the cases where I do have the standard 12 volt large current wires, large current, the higher amperage stuff, the 25 amp stuff, the fans, same thing. Those are the traditional red for power, black for ground. But throughout the rest of the switchgear for this whole car, because of the CCU, there is no power going to the switches. It's just signal and signal ground. So I thought it was a great question and thought I'd give you that quick update. Okay, so I've got my switches, headlight switch, wiper switch, sub-harness, ignition switch, all that stuff's ready to go with its connectors that are going to be mounted up behind that dash panel, which means I'm now in a position to start routing the main harness. And you can see all I've done is, you know, laid a basic loop in there. But now I've got to start deciding exactly how I'm going to route it up the firewall and get it up onto behind the dash. And one of the things I need to consider now is clearance for everything else that's going to be going on behind that dash. So I know that, you know, gauges or some such is going to take up this space, although I know that I can sneak things underneath this steering mount if I needed to and still clear the gauges. But on that side, I'm probably going to have a hazard switch and a headlight on switch, because remember, this is just high beam, low beam. It doesn't actually turn the headlights on. So I'll need a regular, you know, basically one position switch on off. I need a fog light switch probably, and I don't know exactly what else I might do. This is where the radio, stereo, whatever factory goes, obviously glove box. And then this is an important thing that I may end up coming back to. I haven't landed on exactly climate control, air conditioning, heater setup. I don't know what I'm going to do because I just don't know yet. But what I'm going to plan to be able to do is use this, which is the factory, you know, vent control and fan control. And you can see here, it's cable operated, meaning that when you want to move things, I don't know if you can see this, but you know, you want it to go from defrost to, you know, the dash vents or what have you. It's all controlled through mechanically changing flappers in the vent system. It's not in the car right now, but The other thing that this does is it controls the fan speeds. And you can see there's a 3-position fan control. And here you can just see the mechanical model, right? There's main power, or in my case, I would wire signal ground to this. And then as the contact hits this position, it's low, medium, and high. So what I want to do, this is a long way around too, I want to make sure that I have clearance for all of this to fit in the dash. So let me put this in place and I'll show you exactly what I need to worry about. All right, so there's that switch setup put in, and it's not fully installed, but you get the idea. And the good news is, you can see the way this routes is, it's just these 3 control cables that go through the hole in that section of the chassis right there. So not really that big of a deal for clearance, but it is important to know exactly what's going on here. So the good news is, you can see I can pretty much put my switch clips, or my connector clips rather, right here, and they're not going to be in the way of anything. Really, the only thing I got to worry about is, you know, that nothing interferes with all of this stuff or any of the mechanicalness of this sort of a thing while it's moving around, right? There's a couple of arms you can see that move back in here. But it's, you know, it's away from the place where I'd route the wires. But it's just a point made of, when you're doing this sort of thing, try to think ahead, because there's been plenty of times where I've not thought ahead, and you come back later on and go, oh, wait a second, that's not going to work. So I can pretty safely mount those clips and then just work out how I want to route the wiring up to that location to get everything that's going to be in the dashboard connected. So there's those, and I'll zip tie these together. You know, in the end, these will be secured. Maybe I end up with a little P-clamp here just to keep that tied to there so nothing can move around. But the nice thing now is, this is the loom for the 2 ignition wires. These are just the 2 that need to be connected together to wake up the ECU. And then here's the starter control wire. But this will get a 3-pin Deutsch. It'll go right here. And then these are the 4 wiper controls: low, high, park, and intermittent. I don't have the squirt set up. That's going to be coming from the PMU. So there's another set of wires that's going to be coming up from the other power management unit. But these wipers will go into, which one is the wiper one? It's this one. So these are going to come up into this clip here. And then the turn signals, which are also going to be coming from the PMU, will go into that. And you can see it's just a really nice, tidy set of controls going through here. And then the wiring for the fog light lights on switch will simply route up over the top, past the steering column, and over to the other side. They'll have their own little plug in here somewhere too. So anyway, that's how that's going to get set up. And with the dash panel put back on, I didn't wire this one in yet, but this is the other side of the Deutsch connector for the top, the highest, most connector set in here, which is the only one near this vent control. And you can see that, you know, no matter what moves, I'm just going back and forth with these levers, you can see that as the wire comes up into this part of the connector, it's going to clear everything just fine. So I got plenty of room down in there, and that worked out great. So if I decide to go with that control panel, I know that I'm good to go clearance-wise with the electrical stuff that's in there. All right, well, I don't know if this is a major milestone, but it's certainly a milestone. So check this out. Key gone. What's that noise? Well, that is my sub harness connecting into the chassis harness and coming all the way down, going back through this mess and feeding the ECU. So there is my ignition on to wake up the ECU, all toned out. So it works. Not that we wouldn't expect it to, but it's always nice when it does. Now let's test the starter. Now I can only test one circuit at a time, so when I turn the key to on, we're not going to get a tone. But when I go to start, what we want is the beep. Yeah, baby! And let it off, and it works. So, ignition key, sub harness to the ECU, functioning as planned and expected. Yay. Well, it wouldn't be an episode of the Red Barn if there wasn't a bit of a do-over. And maybe a lesson learned. In this case, certainly a lesson learned for me. And here's the thing I've run into. This is my first go at really a much more sophisticated wiring build than I've ever done before. On the LS car, it was a Holley-based system and LS-based stuff, and that's all very well understood, and it's almost like paint by numbers, right? They tell you where every wire goes and what every function was, and so that was really just building the harness, which is plenty of fun and enough work. This is figure out what wire you want to do what in many cases, right? Some of it's hardwired, as you know from earlier episodes, but a lot of it is, pick a signal wire, figure out what you want it to do, where you want it to run. In the case of what you've been seeing me work on with these switches lately, it's the signal wire going to signal ground, sending that information to the ECU, and then the ECU then being told, okay, if you see that condition, do this, send power somewhere. So here's my lesson learned and what's going to require a bit of a do-over. It turns out, and I guess I should have known this, but again, like I said, I'm learning as I go. When you have a single device, the signal ground that you're working with has to go to the device, and everything that's using that signal ground needs to come from the same device. Meaning, I can't say, oh, I'm going to use this signal wire from the ECU, which lives under the seat. That's why I keep pointing like this. I can't use a signal wire from the ECU and have it go to signal ground, the signal ground being the one that originates in the power management unit. And unfortunately, when I was doing my planning, I didn't realize it, I guess. I wasn't thinking about it. I didn't realize I needed to think about it. So what I have set up is what would potentially be what's called a ground loop. And that, thankfully, as I was starting to plan this out to start pull wires from the PDM, I thought, wait a second, where do I do the signal ground for? And all of a sudden it was like, uh-oh. And I did a bit of research, and sure enough, everything that originates with a particular device needs to be complete with that particular device. So what that meant was I had to go back, and I'm showing you this. You're not going to be able to read this, but this is the printout. This is what's called the I/O report, the in-output report from the ECU, and it includes the PDM. Once you tell the system you got a PDM, and it's every wire. In the case of what you're looking at here, wires that are in use and what they do. So I've had to go back through from a planning perspective and say, okay, hold on a second. Let's look at something like the windshield wipers. I think you recall from the last episode, I said, oh yeah, the wire for the squirt function is going to come from the PDM. Well, think about it, right? That wiring that I did on that switch has a signal ground that, guess what, comes from the ECU. And what that means is the squirt function signal and the power that's going to run to the little pump motor that is going to drive the squirters, that all has to come from the ECU. It can't come from the PDM. So I had to go back through and replan which wire is going to be my signal wire for the, because I've got signal ground coming from the ECU. I have to have all the signal coming from the ECU, and I have to have all the power wires coming from the ECU. So that required me to go back through and say, what exactly do I need to do? Replan that out. And it's not the end of the world. It was like 7 or 8 wires that I had to reassign. And let me show you the good news about that here. I'll show you that in a second. You can just go into the system and reassign the wires. And here I am in the Haltech programming software. And if I just focus in on the windshield wipers and look at the wiring section, I misspoke earlier when I said I had wired in the signal ground from the ECU. I hadn't done that yet. I was planning to. And so what I've decided to do after looking at everything was I've decided to run the whole wiper system off of the PDM. So here you can just see this is the result of having done the remapping. But here are all my signal inputs, for intermittent and high and low speed. And these are the two power output wires. And you'll notice every one of these wires is labeled PD16. That tells me where it's originating. And these are the two high current outputs that'll drive the actual wiper motor. But when I talked about having to remap things and how it's not the end of the world, the nice thing is you can just come into your setup and click on the assign button here, and you can look through your system, whatever devices you're running. If I'm looking for the power management unit, and I can say show me any available wires, and I can come through and simply say, oh, I want to move it to this wire. So I can do that with any of the power wires or any of the signal wires. So it's a simple matter of doing the work. The more important part is doing all the planning that leads up to what changes you want to make. But you can see how quick this was to just, once I figured out what the plan was going to be, to keep these devices separate for each of the functions, so there's no potential for ground looping or anything like that. And then I just print out a new I/O report. I just walk through my whole system and verify that everything's pointed where it needs to go. So anyway, pretty straightforward. Now, all I'm going to have to do to fully correct everything is go back through the harness. That's why it's not sheathed, thankfully. I'm going to have to reinstall a couple of the wires from the ECU into the ECU wiring harness that I had previously thought I wasn't going to need, and I had depinned them and pulled them out of the harness. Again, not that big of a deal, but it's going to probably take me, half a day or so to rewire all this stuff to get everything from each device to where it needs to go, so that it's a single source signal ground, and power from that device. So a little bit of a step backwards, but a great lesson learned. Don't create ground loops. Well, another redo. You recall I took all this wonderful time to test and wire up my little sub harness for my turn signal high beam switch. And as I was revisiting the wiring, what I realized was I had made an assumption, or I had not thought this all the way through, specifically around the high beam flash. And that was, I had everything wired up so that, yes, when this was pushed into the high beam setting, the high beam signal was sent. But I also used that same wire to send the high beam flash. What's the problem? Remember I said there's no ability for this switch to turn the headlights on. That's a separate switch. It's just going to be a simple on-off switch. So with the switch turned on, everything's great, right? It goes on to low beam automatically, unless this was in high beam mode when you turn the lights on, in which case it would see high beam. But let's assume you turn the headlights on and you're driving along, you put it in high beam, you put it back in low beam, and you want to flash your high beams when your headlights are on. Great, flash, no problem. Turn the headlights off, I want to still be able to flash the headlight. And it would still do that because this ECU would see a high beam signal even though the headlights were turned off. You see where this is going, right? If I put the high beam switch to on, the high beams would come on even though the headlight switch was turned off. What that means is the flash circuit, it has to be an entirely separate circuit. I unsheathed it, and I have prepared another wire, and all I need to do is unsolder the common, what I use as a common signal ground, and I just need to solder this thing in here and take it down to a new wire and a new added function I added to the ECU, which is called high beam flash, a whole separate feature than high beam on. Anyway, that's the good news. If you'll recall as well, I'd only used 5 of the positions in here. I now have the ability to use that last position up. And the other thing I realized is I have a low, a low beam on wire. I actually don't need it because it's going to go on with the switch. So I still only need 5 of these. I just don't know if it's going to be worth my trouble to unpin it. So I'm now going to go back in and solve this problem. So as I said in the title section of this particular part of the episode, plan ahead. All right, so let's talk progress for this week. Mostly it was planning and a bunch of redoing, which is not very exciting to watch, and I've created quite a mess inside the car as I'm trying to figure out routing and all that good stuff. But you can see the turn signal. You wouldn't maybe know this, but that's what this lower one is. This is the turn signal and headlight high beam, low beam setup that's wired up. And if I set you down and try to do this testing, and with any luck, I can reach over here, and there it is. That tone is the left-hand turn signal saying, yep, I am connected all the way down to the appropriate pin that goes into the ECU. So now I'm just walking through and doing the testing of all these circuits to make sure every switch is doing what it's supposed to do. It's mapped to the right place throughout the harness, and I'm getting connection back to the ECU. So as boring as that is, that's going to be probably the next couple days to get all the wires routed for everything. I've got my switch gear coming in. I've ordered that. So I've got a very simple pull on off headlight on switch. Same thing with the hazard switch and a fog light switch. So I'll have those all taken care of. And then it's really down to figuring out exactly how I want to mount the power management unit, because I have to have that laid in before I can do the wiring up to that's going to power the fans and the fuel pump. And so a couple things I got to work out is, how do I want to pass those wires through to the front of the car? Am I going to do another bulkhead connector? I was thinking about getting another one just like this, where I can pass all my little wires plus the big power wires for those high draw systems, the fans and the fuel pump. And that might be kind of tidy. I could do a nice little 90 somewhere up under there, and just have like an in the trunk harness for everything in the front of the car. So we'll see. I'm not sure exactly how that's going to go. But with that, I'm going to call it for this week and say I really appreciate you guys hanging with me while I'm going through this stuff. I know it's not the most exciting thing to watch, but it's an invisibly super important part of the build. You know, nobody ever asks about wiring, as you've heard me say in the past. But I am making progress even though it doesn't look like it. So, as always, I appreciate you guys watching. Please like, share, subscribe, and tell all your friends. Have a safe holiday season. I'll be back next week with more exciting stuff. And everybody take care until we talk again. Bye-bye.